Welcome to the Group Dentistry Now Show, the voice of the DSO industry. Kim Larson and Bill Neumann talk to industry leaders about their challenges, successes, and the future of group dentistry. Visit groupdentistrynow.com for more DSO analysis, news, and events. Looking for a job or have a job to fill? Visit joindso.com. We hope you enjoy today's show.
Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Group Dentistry Now Show. I'm Bill Neumann, and we're going to talk all things cybersecurity in the DSO and dental space. And we have an expert in cybersecurity. His name is Gary Salman. Gary, welcome to the Group Dentistry Now Show.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It sounds like looking at your bio here, you do quite a bit of speaking. So and you sound like you were on a podcast last night talking about cybersecurity to orthodontists.
I was for almost an hour and a half long. It was very eye-opening for a lot of people.
There you go. Well, I'm sure this will be eye-opening as well for the DSO space. So Gary is the Chief Executive Officer at Talon Security. And he actually has his BA in Business Administration from Muhlenberg College, also the co-founder. Gary is dedicated to data security and understanding the latest trends in the dental industry. He has a proven executive management track record and over 30 years of experience in software development and computer IT and development of one of the first cloud-based healthcare systems. Gary and I were talking a little bit off camera about, he has been around for 30 years, like I have been, and talked a little bit about computers like the Commodore 64 and some of the older models that maybe a lot of people don't know of. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. Gary's a sought-after speaker and writer. He's lectured nationally on cybersecurity threats to over 8,000 individuals, and has trained thousands of practices across the U.S. on how to maintain their best practices in cybersecurity, and has been featured in over 30 national publications and news stories. Gary has over 15 years as an instructor at West Point, and he's involved in law enforcement. Talon has been called in to assist in some of the largest distributed ransomware attacks in U.S. history, and Gary is an expert in both preventative measures as well as breach recovery. So again, thanks, Gary, for being here today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about Talon Security and the cybersecurity that you do there specifically for the dental industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So we founded Talon Security a little over 3 years ago based on demand. The role that I played at a previous company, kind of opened my eyes. I was starting to get phone calls and said, hey, I'm a group, and our network got hit with ransomware. We've been down for 5 days. What can you do to help us? And I'm like, that's not really what we do. I can't really help you. And I think I started connecting the dots. I'm like, wow, I wasn't really receiving these phone calls before. And now more than ever, these larger practices are getting hit. So we founded Talon. And I think the best way to think about what we do is we're not a piece of software. We're a full cybersecurity solution. And that's the differential, right? Anyone can go out and buy a piece of software, drop it on the network, kind of feel good about what that piece of software does. But that's a very, very small piece of the puzzle from a cybersecurity perspective. So what we do for DSOs and large groups is look at their organization holistically, understand where they have risk by identifying the risk, right? Running different types of tools, techniques, interviews with their IT departments, and then basically crafting custom security solutions that are effective. So we do everything from vulnerability management, which analyzes every device on the network to try and figure out how hackers can breach a specific device or devices. We do what's called penetration testing. So our ethical hackers will literally hit, the DSO's infrastructure by, assuming the role of a criminal, seeing if they can break in. And if we can break in, then we sit down with the IT resource and say, hey, here's how we broke in. Here's what you need to do to harden your network. We're a huge proponent of training, right? So if you're not training your staff, which by the way is required under HIPAA, you have to do it. If you're not training your staff on cybersecurity threats, if you don't have an ongoing program, it's not part of your education, you're eventually going to get hit. Why? Because you have team members and doctors that are sitting there going click, click, click on everything that comes through on their email. And all it takes is one wrong click and you turn around and the entire office or your entire infrastructure is encrypted with ransomware. That's how quickly this stuff can spread. So, we do that. And then, we do a cybersecurity assessment. Some people call it an audit. And what we do there is we really try and understand what's called your attack surface. There are so many entry points into networks nowadays. And a lot of times, you grow quickly as a DSO and you don't even comprehend where you can get hit. You're focusing on that server or the workstation, but you forgot about all of these remote employees and this third-party software that's sitting on these computers and the IT vendors that are gaining access to your systems. What if any of those third parties become a victim? And then the hackers use their systems to attack your DSO. These are the things you have to think about. And if you're not, you're presenting your organization with a tremendous amount of risk. So ultimately, what are we doing? We're helping you mitigate risk. We're helping to try and keep your doors open, right? And the patients flowing through the doors versus having to shut your doors for 2 to 3 weeks to recover from these attacks.
So, you touched on ransomware. So let's talk about trends that you're seeing when it comes to cyber attacks against, any size practice, whether it's, I've got 3 or 4 locations all the way up to some of the larger DSOs that we've seen in the news. Some of them actually, have been hit. So,
yeah. There's been quite a few that have been public, and then you have all the other ones that have kept it quiet.
Right.
So what are the trends? And I think this is probably one of the most important things for this podcast, which is it's not like it was a couple years ago where the hackers would take out a server or a couple workstations and then, you try and recover. What we're seeing now is a couple of things. First, about 70% of ransomware victims are also victims of data theft. We are actively working multiple cases right now in the dental space where the hackers first breached the network. They remained on the network undetected for at least 3 weeks. They offloaded all of the data, literally downloaded their entire patient database, x-rays, HR files, financials, every piece of data on the network. And then they hit them with ransomware. And when they hit you with ransomware nowadays, it's typically 100% strike, meaning every device is encrypted. And as part of their initial surveillance on the network, guess what they do? They figure out where you're backing up, how you back up, and they take out that infrastructure. The reason they do this is it basically guarantees that you're going to pay them, right? If you have no recoverable data and they've stolen your data, if you are an executive of a DSO, what would you do? You're probably going to pay. Over 90% of our clients are forced to pay the ransom because there is no other option. So this trend of the data theft, the surveillance is pretty much almost 100%. The other thing that we see is the installation of screen sharing software by the hackers. So when we get into these systems, what we see is literally products like Screen Connect and some other ones installed on every single computer. And we'll talk to the IT company or in-house IT and say, hey, do you guys use this product? They're like, no. And we're like, all right, it's on every single one of your computers. So what does that translate to? They were sitting there and literally watching every single thing they did. Every patient record you opened, every email you sent, every insurance company you logged into. That's a problem. We're dealing with a smaller DSO data breach right now out on the West Coast. And when we got in there and started analyzing some of the malicious code that was installed by the hackers, our security engineers said, hey, you got to look at this. This piece of malicious code not only installed a screen sharing application, it also installed 2 others. One was keylogger, right? So as Mary logs into, their insurance company to, look up claims, it stole her credentials. The other one was a password cracking tool. So any stored passwords on the network were potentially vulnerable. So this is no joke what's going on right now, right? The level of sophistication is unbelievable. You have to understand who you're up against. You're up against criminal operations, typically from Russia or China, that are generating hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the organizations that typically targets the dental space is a group called Soda Nikibi out of Russia. They've publicly come out and said last year they generated $500 million in ransomware payments. Okay. So think about that. They can afford to hire the best programmers, right? They have literally tech support when, their tool to unlock the files doesn't work properly. They run what I call a legitimate, illegitimate operation, right? It's a criminal operation, but they have customer service, right? They follow through when stuff doesn't work. You just can't make this stuff up. So that's a primary trend. The other thing that you have to be cognizant of is the data theft. So after they steal the data, they will publish it to a dark web site called a shaming website. And these are publicly accessible. If you know how to get to the dark web, you can get on these sites and they will show you every single business, company, healthcare entity that they've hit. And they will present you with 1 to 10% of all the data they stole. So you can do this right now. You can find dental practice data on these shaming websites, and I lecture on this, and you click on the name of the practice, then it'll show you hundreds of files. You click on the file and up pops a photograph of the patient, up pops a health history form, an EOB, a driver's license, right? A scanned insurance card, and it's all there for the public to view. And they do this for a primary reason, right? And the reason is that they want to prove to the practice, you want to mess with us, go for it. You don't want to pay for it, pay the ransom, pay the extortion fee. Come look at this website, and then you can make a decision what you want to do. Because if you opt not to pay, we'll auction off 100% of your data, and that's what happens. And we're dealing right now with a practice that had their data stolen, and they were asking $150,000 not to auction off their data, which is a lot of money, for most size organizations, on top of all the other fees. So you figure this group's $250,000 into it. That doesn't even include any type of compliance or legal issues that they're going to have. So
you talked a little bit about entry points. There are multiple entry points, and there's also multiple types of cybersecurity risks. So maybe you can touch on a little bit, like how do they get in potentially? Right. What are the types of risks? Because it doesn't sound, it's just not ransomware. It's just not like, hey, pay us $10,000 or $150,000 and it goes away. That they already have that data, right? I mean, it's so even if they open things back up, the data is still out there.
So the data's out there, and you got to understand that when these networks get hit, you pretty much have to destroy your whole network, right? You got to wipe the whole network out, rebuild every computer, right? By reinstalling the operating systems, your practice management software, your imaging, because the computers are infected, they've been compromised. If you don't do that, you can turn the network back on, and 2 weeks later, it starts all over again. So you got to think from a business operational standpoint, what would that mean to your business? If you literally had to close your DSO for 2 to 3 weeks to rebuild your network, maybe even longer, and then ask yourself, could we even do that? If I have thousands of computers in our environment, could I rebuild all those computers and servers in short order? It's a situation, an exercise you have to start thinking about. That's a problem, and you gotta have a plan. And I think a lot of organizations think they have a plan, which is, hey, we'll recover from backups. We're in the cloud, right? Or we have multiple backups and we back up into the cloud. But when you find out all your local backups are destroyed and then they erased your cloud data, which we see all the time, what are you going to do? So I think that's a challenge. I think you had another question.
Well, yeah, you talked a little bit about entry points. So we hear about phishing attacks through email. So that's something that I think most people are familiar with, whether they still do it or not.
Yeah,
but
they do.
But then also you talked about network breaches. So that's really something a bit different.
Yeah, so let's cover those. Let's talk about the entry points. So you nailed it. Phishing is a huge problem. Phishing and spear phishing, also known as social engineering, where they're trying to trick individuals within the organization to give something up. It could be the giving up of their username and password. It could be the transfer of funds, right? So we can talk about that and some of the stories that we've seen firsthand. It could be the enticement of a click, right? Clicking on a link that results in the downloading of malicious code. And that ultimately results in the execution of a ransomware attack. So click risk is a big issue, right? And what I hear a lot of, the executives say at DSOs is, well, we've talked to our staff about that, or IT guys have sent emails out warning about phishing emails. That's not cybersecurity awareness training. That's like, hey, a little bit of heads up here, just be aware and don't start clicking on stuff. That doesn't work, right? That's not training. That's not education. The team's like, whatever, I'm fine. I'm smart. I'm good. And then all of a sudden you turn around and you're down for 2 or 3 weeks. And the financial impact is unbelievable. Think about, do the back of the napkin math, how much each one of your practices generates per day, multiply it by 15 days. And the math is ugly. So training your staff and testing them, that's critical, right? So one of the things that our organization does is launch simulated phishing attacks against every single employee and doctor and executive to see if they're, clicking on things they shouldn't. And then what we do is we use it for positive reinforcement, not negative. And we say, hey, listen, unfortunately you clicked on this link. Here's a little training video you should watch, and, and acknowledge that you've watched it. And it's very, very effective, to do that. The other entry point is a hacking incident, right? I think most individuals who are not very tech savvy, and we see this a lot in the C-suite, except for maybe like a CIO, CTO, or CISO. They don't understand that hacking is a very significant problem right now in terms of direct attacks against the network versus phishing. Most people are like, well, they're going to phish us and that's how they get in. I will tell you that a lot of the breaches that we've been called into, it wasn't a phishing attack. Sure, those exist, but it was a direct hack on the firewall, on a server, on a device in the group. And that type of risk had never been identified. So what we often see is that these IT vendors will install firewalls and technology, but they're not tested for vulnerabilities, right? So basically the best way to explain a vulnerability is to kind of compare it to your home, right? So at your house, you have doors, you have windows. Some people have a little lock on their door that they turn on the handle. It's a $15 Home Depot lock, and a criminal comes by and gives a little kick and the door flies open. Or they just leave their windows open and the criminals come by and lift the windows up and crawl into your window. Conceptually, the same thing applies to all the technology in your office. What I tell everyone is this: everything connected to your network is either vulnerable, has been vulnerable, or will be vulnerable. And the reason for this is they have an operating system, right? So that's smart TV, that thermostat, your security cameras, your voice over IP telephones, and then obviously your laptops and tablets and servers. These are all targets. And if you are not implementing a stringent vulnerability management solution where you're using very sophisticated software to analyze these devices, you're going to get hit. Do you know why? Because the hackers are going to do it, right? They're going to scan your network. Right? If you ever pulled your firewall logs, you will see your network is constantly getting pounded. Every couple minutes, someone's hitting it, right? And the firewall is doing what it's supposed to be doing if it's configured properly. But at some point, an exposure occurs to a device inside the office, or more likely, the firewall is not configured, or an IT person made a mistake and opened up a port on the firewall and forgot to close it, and you get hit. So a vulnerability management solution scans these devices in real time and says, hey, Black Talon, I got a problem here. I got a vulnerability on my machine. It's a high risk. It can be exploited. What do you want to do? Right? And our security guys will analyze it and then reach out to the DSO, either directly if they have internal IT, or if they have external IT, reach out to them and be like, hey, I need you to log into Office 15, workstation number 7. You got to apply this technique to eliminate that vulnerability. So if you're an executive, right, an owner of a DSO, and you're not getting monthly vulnerability reports, right, from a cybersecurity firm, if you're not getting real-time alerts, eventually you're going to have a problem, right? And what we see, Bill, is when we do these breach responses, right, it's really called incident response, and we start scouring the network for hacking tools, you know what we find? Vulnerability management scanners. Right? So the hackers will deploy kind of the same technology that we use on these networks, and within minutes expose all the devices that they can exploit. Right? So That's a huge problem. And what vulnerability management does is tries to prevent someone from getting in, right? So we make sure all the windows and doors are locked. And then B, if they do manage to get into a device, a computer, for instance, we box them in, right? We limit their ability to move around the network, because what the hackers do is when they get on that machine, they're going to deploy software, hacking tools that try and figure out what the network looks like, what devices are on it, what other tools they can run to exploit it. And if we basically lock the network down in a way, it's like every door they try and hit, they just get blocked. And it's very effective. It's not the end all to be all, but it is a very effective layer of security. And I will tell you, very few DSOs that we've ever come across have any type of vulnerability management plan in place. They simply think, hey, let's patch these computers and we're good. It just doesn't work that way, because so many computers miss patches. Team members decline the patches. As you know, I don't need that update. I don't need this update. I haven't updated in 4 weeks. I'm going to ignore that. That's just how it works, right? I was on this podcast last night and one of the doctors admitted, he's like, yeah, I see that. I just hit ignore. And, after I explained this to him, he's like, yeah, I guess I'll never hit ignore again. Right. This is a way that the hackers get in, exploit these vulnerabilities. The other big one is third-party risk. I would say most of you have now heard of the company called SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds was part of this massive breach back in Q4 of last year, where supposedly hackers from Russia gained access to the SolarWinds software, created what's called basically a poison pill, which means they modified their code. And then the SolarWinds software connected to 18,000 businesses and 40 government agencies, and literally just downloaded their malicious code into all these machines. Why? Because this is what's called a remote management tool. And I will be willing to bet close to 100% of everyone that's listening to this podcast has a remote management tool in their office. That's how their internal or external IT resources support them. It allows them to push patches, to connect to these computers. So when Stacy or Dave calls support and be like, hey, my computer's not working properly, they use their remote management tool to connect. So what happens here is a lot of these IT companies, which is a third party, they have no true cybersecurity in place themselves. They take the position of, oh, we're an IT company, we're good, well, we can protect ourselves, we do this all day long, for 20 years, but they're not being independently checked by another third party, i.e. an independent cybersecurity firm. So what happens is this IT company becomes the entry point, right? So there are threat groups, Soda is one of them, that target IT companies in the US. And they break into the IT company, then use their remote management tool to attack every single one of their clients. So it's like a hand grenade. They gain access to 300 of their clients, they pull the pin on the hand grenade, they throw it, it strikes every single computer and server in their environment, and then they walk away and they just wait for the millions of dollars to pour in. And the problem here is, think about this. If you're using external IT, when that type of strike occurs, they're not showing up at your offices, right? Because they literally have 300, 500 clients calling them saying, hey, we're encrypted with ransomware, and then do the math. The average practice has about a dozen computers, right? So you're talking 3,000 to 4,000 computers that are fully destroyed with ransomware. How are they going to rebuild those? It's not possible. Some of these IT companies literally go out of business. They can't recover from that. So understanding third-party risk. So if you're a DSO, one of the things you have to do is go back to any of these vendors that have access to your system and say, I need a document from you showing that you're being audited on a monthly basis by a third-party cybersecurity firm. They can provide an executive summary just saying, hey, I'm ABC cybersecurity firm. I audit, ABC IT, and here's what we do for them, and they're passing. Ask for that. If your IT vendor is not willing to produce that document, you really need to consider potentially moving to a different IT company, because what that IT company is telling you is they don't care, right? They don't understand what's really going on in the world right now and how they are a target. Versus an IT company is like, yeah, look, we know what's going on here. We have an audit done every month. Here, Mr. or Mrs. Executive, here, doctor, here's the proof that we're doing this. You have to understand third-party risk and you have to mitigate it. Because here's the deal. This is your patient data. Even if that IT company, that cloud provider, whatever it might be, is the reason why your patient data was compromised, you still own the breach. That's how the laws are written. They're your patients, they're your records, right? And then the question is, did you ever analyze your third-party risk? Did you do anything to try and prevent this? And you know how lawyers get, with this type of stuff, they're going to start pointing fingers really quickly and say, hey, you're a big operation. How did you not know about this? You didn't ask your IT vendor for proof they have cybersecurity in place, and things spiral out of control really quick. So yeah. Those are the primary risks, phishing, a direct hacking event, and third party. And there's some other ones that we could talk about, like insider attacks. We don't see that too often in the dental space where employees are specifically hired by that organization in order to steal information. But we see that more like in hospitals and things like that.
It's probably important to touch on, since you mentioned third party. Let's just highlight again what you were talking about, because there is a big difference between an IT company and a cybersecurity company, right? So, right. And so a DSO may say, well, we have IT covered already, but right. It's not cybersecurity.
Huge differential. It's just like in medicine, right? So the best analogy I have for you, Bill, is this. You go to your internist for your annual physical exam, and doctor sits you on the table, listens to your heart, and she says, hey, listen, I think you got a problem with your heart valve here. So guess what? I just built a new operatory right next door. I'm going to walk you over there. We're going to put some general anesthesia, hook you up, and I'll just do the valve replacement today right here. And you're like, whoa, I need to kind of go to a cardiothoracic surgeon for that? No, I got you covered. We're good. I watched a video, right? But believe it or not, this is what's going on in the IT space. You have IT companies now that literally hang a shingle on their door. We do cybersecurity. I'm dealing with this with a DSO up in New England right now because their IT vendors like, hey, we do security. So I told one of the executives, I said, go back to them and ask them for credentials. Ask them for, the certifications of these individuals that are providing security to your group. He came back. He's like, you're right. He's like, they don't have any. I said, that's the problem, right? They go out and buy a piece of software and they resell it to you and say, hey, John, I got you covered. See that piece of software? That's the most advanced software out there. It doesn't typically work, but you don't know what questions to ask and you trust, right, their response. So really the differential is this. IT companies play a very important role. We work with hundreds across the country, and there are some really, really strong, good ones out there. But their job is to provide IT support. They configure your network, they keep it up and running, they bring in new technology, they support you when devices are down, and they provide basic security through firewalls and antivirus software. A cybersecurity company will basically come in, first analyze where you have risk in your operations and ask very important questions like, hey, what's the most important part of your organization? What needs to be protected the most? So we understand their mindset. And then we start having conversations like, okay, well, here's what we can do to protect you. Because as the size of the organization grows, the types of security measures that have to be put in place are proportional, right? We're not going to take a DSO with 100 locations and provide the same security to them as we would with a DSO that has, say, half a dozen, because can't do that. It doesn't work financially. So the cyber firms will come in, analyze all this, right, and then use highly credentialed individuals, right? So we have individuals in our organization that have what are called a CISP, CISSP. We have others that are HCISPP, and these are legit kind of board certifications given by nonprofit organizations. And many of these certifications require you to be in security for like 10 years before you can even sit to take the exam. And it's a very, very difficult test to pass. Literally the book is like this, right? I think it's like 600 pages long that you have to go through and understand. And that's the big differential, right? You have to understand that there's a big difference between people who pretend to do security and people who do it 24/7 and have credentials behind their names, just like doctors who go and get board certified, right? And go through dental school and medical school versus, hey, I watched a video and I have a scalpel, I can do surgery, I'm good, right? And that's the issue right now that we see in this space. And the big problem is you can't have your IT company checking their own security, right? It's like you saying to your bookkeeper, hey, I need you to audit this and make sure everything's okay. Who would do that? You go to your accountant and be like, hey, we have a bookkeeper. I need you to make sure that he or she is doing the right thing and make sure we don't have a problem here. You probably know what I'm talking about, right? Any type of theft or improprietary things going on. So that's really, really important because, you can't have kind of what the expression we use is you can't have the fox guarding the hen house. And many of these IT companies are building the same networks today as they did years ago. Same technology, right? Same pieces of software, telling clients, hey, you're fine. I think one of the most eye-opening statements I have, ever heard. I was on a briefing with a government agency. We were doing a roundtable discussion. There were executives from the largest hospital systems across the US on this call. There's about 30 of us on this call. And one of the agents said this. He said, here's the problem in our world right now. You have vendors who don't understand the capabilities of their software, right? Meaning off the shelf like security or backup solutions, improperly advising their clients on the technology and making promises that they can't deliver on. So you have executives who are like, oh, we just bought a $10,000 backup solution. It's ransomware proof. Okay, that might be the case, but does that mean that a hacker can't gain access and erase it? Well, I never thought about that. This is what's happening right now, right? So you have vendors who are supplying this technology, over-promising, right, and under-delivering, and then the owners of these organizations and DSOs, they feel good. They're like, hey, we're doing the right thing here. But in the end, you have to have an overall solution. You have to have a strategy for cyber. You can't take off the shelf software, throw it on your network and pretend everything's going to be fine. I will tell you that in almost all of the cases we investigate and do a forensics analysis of the attack, you know what the hackers do? They shut down all the computer's defenses. They shut down the antivirus software, right? They shut down other technologies that these computers have in place to try and prevent the installation of this malicious code. Sometimes you'll see them attempt it 50, 75 times, and eventually the hackers get it and the computer's defenseless. And then the ransomware code gets installed and it's all over. So I think that's something that everyone needs to think about is, hey, I can't have the fox guarding the hen house. I need an independent third party analyzing this network, constantly hitting it to make sure, keeping my windows locked and my doors locked. That's what you need to do. That's part of running a business nowadays. And if you look at the medical space, Bill, this is kind of the norm, right? There are many large physicians groups, medium-sized physicians groups, almost all the hospitals, they'll have in-house IT. They almost always have external cyber, right?
Okay.
So that's how it works in the dental space. We don't see that much, but that's what has to happen.
So that's a great lead into this next question. So from a sophistication level standpoint, the dental industry, emerging groups, DSOs of all sizes, you're really seeing that maybe the industry's lagging behind a little bit in other healthcare verticals.
Yep.
On the cybersecurity side of things.
Absolutely. To put it into perspective, think of it this way. In the medical space, if you're a vendor and you go to a medium, large physicians group or hospital, you're like, hey, we have these great new med pumps, these vital monitors, right? This imaging equipment. You guys interested? Sure. Okay. Well, before you can come to our facility, I need to see the reports on the cybersecurity audit of these devices because I'm not hooking one of those things up to my network. So what I'll say to every DSO right now is, have you ever done that? Can any of your vendors actually provide that type of information? And I have deep roots into imaging and software in the dental space. I don't know of any vendors that are doing that right now in the dental space. right? But these are the things that have to happen. So to your point, lagging behind, sure, we're years behind in the dental space from a security perspective. We're too trusting, and that's ultimately a problem, right? Because when things go sideways, as I alluded to before, you own it. You own it, regardless of who caused it. You own it. You're going to have to deal with the breach. It's your patient records.
So I probably know the answer to this question now, but would you say that most DSOs are more reactive than proactive? So that there's a breach, and then what do we do now? I mean, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what's going on in the dental space as a whole. I think what happens is people look at it and say, we can't spend any more money on technology, right? And then if you compare the small amount of money you have to spend on cyber versus the unbelievable amount of money you're going to spend on a breach, it doesn't equate, right? You can't even put that in a spreadsheet and pretend that that's going to make sense. And that's a problem. And until you are actually a victim of this and realize the short, medium, and long-term damage this does to your organization, it often doesn't compute, right? Or you're not digging in deep enough, and you're saying, you're trusting, I should say, what you're being told, right? So if you're an executive of one of these organizations and you're being told, hey, our IT company does this, we have some security in place, and you turn your back and be like, we're fine, it's not going to work. As an executive of the organization, you need to know exactly what is being done from a security perspective. I'm not saying you have to know from a technical perspective, but you'd have to know what's going on, because when it goes sideways, you're going to have to answer those questions, especially if you're owned, right? Or there's investors in your organization, right? You're going to have to answer to a board. You're going to have to answer to the owners, to the partners, and explain why you didn't know that you didn't have security in place, or why you thought you had security in place, but you actually didn't. So those are the types of things that, you can take away from this presentation and say, all right, I'm going to spend, hours digging into this, and I want people to answer these questions. Yeah, so I think they are reactive. To answer your initial question, almost everything we see, right, on our incident response part of our business, it's all reactive. There was basically nothing in place, or more likely, they thought there was something in place that was going to protect them. There was a small group, a couple offices out in Denver, Colorado, specialists, and their malpractice carrier had sent them a letter about 2 weeks prior to their attack. And it said to them, you need to sit down with your IT vendor and understand what they're doing to protect their infrastructure and what they're doing to protect you. They called the owner of the company in. He sat down with them. He literally said, I'm an engineer. I know how to do all this stuff. And you guys are totally fine. You have state-of-the-art security. Fast forward 2 weeks, they got hit, right? And I remember sitting down, there was 6 doctors in the office, multiple administrators for this practice, and they were literally in tears. They're like, we tried to do the right thing. We assumed we were fine, and we trusted this individual, and now our offices are closed. And they were down for 2 full weeks recovering. And then it took weeks to get back up. And it's a huge problem, right? And so there's your perfect example of being reactive and not truly understanding what was in place, not understanding the landscape, and saying, all right, that's cool, you're doing our technology, you're great. And they said he was a really good IT company, right? Him and his company were really good. But when it came to the security, it was lapsed. It was lagging. And when we did our tests on the network, we're like, whoa, this is not a good situation. You guys had major holes in your network, and that's one of the reasons you got hit. So I think you have to move from a reactive phase to a proactive, preventative phase in your organization. Because you speak to anyone in law enforcement that specializes in cyber, they all say the same thing: you're going to get hit. All right, it's just a matter of time, whether it's this year or next year. You're absolutely gonna get hit unless you're implementing advanced security, in your operation. So
yeah, well, so Gary, here's a couple other things. I mean, all these questions come to mind, right? You start to peel back the onion, and you go, my goodness. We talked a little bit off camera earlier about a lot of these DSOs, whether they're large or whether they're emerging, they're acquiring practices. So as you acquire these practices, they're using different practice management software. So there's vulnerability potentially at the practice level, and it might be different, right, because of the systems that they're using.
So it's a huge problem, right? So we're working with, a couple DSOs, and most are in growth mode, right? They're acquiring, gobbling up practices left and right. And then you realize, oh, well, they have 5 different practice management softwares. They have 5 different IT vendors. They're using different imaging equipment. Some of the, equipment is old, antiquated. They have out-of-date operating systems, and they're bringing this into their environment. And depending on how their network's configured, that one practice could present risk to all of the other offices, right? And how do you know when you acquire a practice that there's not an active attack going on right now? So one of the things that is very prevalent in the mergers and acquisitions in the business world is due diligence from a cyber perspective, right? A cyber company comes in, does analysis of the network, provides, the PE venture capital company and says, hey, here's what we uncovered. Here's the potential risk, right? Here's a risk score. We ran tools to determine whether or not there's been a potential breach. And now you can make good decisions on that acquisition. But going back to your original question, it's a big problem, right? Because you bring these networks in and introduce them into these bigger environments. If you don't immediately analyze that office, understand where they have risk, that one office could, impact your entire organization overnight. So it's definitely an issue that I don't see a lot of DSOs addressing, and I think they should. Because what happens is all of a sudden, hey, we got 20 new offices we have to onboard, and they're dealing with HR and financials and marketing and onboarding and processes and procedures and endless spreadsheets on how to make sure, we optimize our investment. And then kind of the last thing is technology, and that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So. And they're focused on the next 20 that they're going to acquire. So that's exactly. and I would almost venture to say that, and you mentioned it earlier, from an investment standpoint, if you're looking to eventually have a private equity investor, or you have one already, I mean, I would say that you increase the value of the business by being more secure with cybersecurity, right? I mean, it just makes sense that an investor, especially one that maybe has investments in other healthcare verticals that are more knowledgeable, right? That are less reactive and more proactive when it comes to cybersecurity, is already expecting this to be in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we did a huge test on a DSO. They had 200 locations. They had internal IT folks, and they're like, no, we're secure, we're good. And they did hire us, so they did the right thing. And we did testing on the network. And then when the reports came back, they're like, wow, this is not what we had expected. This is a lot worse. We thought we were doing a really good job at locking down our network. But that's the difference, right? They were relying on hardware and software to secure their environment, but they hadn't done a penetration test, right, on all their offices. And that's what the hackers do. They're pen testing your networks, whether or not you want to believe it. And until you equal or try and get one step above them, you're not going to win the game. And that's why this stuff's so important nowadays. So yeah, the other thing we see with DSOs that are in quick acquisition mode is their vendors can't keep up, right? So they have 1 or 2 IT companies, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, here's 200, 300 more computers you have to support. And they're like, we don't even have enough people, right? We can't hire people fast enough to keep up with your growth. And guess what happens? Mistakes get made, networks aren't configured properly, firewall settings are missed, and then you become a victim. You know what happens in your organization when you are maxing out your team members, your employees. Mistakes start getting made. And the same thing happens with these vendors, right? The stuff's not getting configured properly, and they leave gaping holes in these networks. And then you turn around and you're like, how the heck did this happen? And when you do a root cause analysis, you realize, okay, well, this vendor could not keep up with our growth. It's an issue. So.
Well, Gary, I think we probably made some people rather nervous with this podcast, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So what would you say, this will be the last question, but
sure.
If somebody wants to, the DSOs, the emerging groups that are listening, hey, we really need to kind of figure out where we stand, right? We thought maybe IT was doing something right. We thought cybersecurity we were secure, maybe we're not. is there some type of audit process that you all do first, or what would be a next logical step for somebody that goes, I'm not sure where we stand?
Right. So absolutely. So one of the things that can be done is basically kind of like an initial assessment. Think of it as like an initial exam on a patient, where we'll come in, we'll do, a risk analysis, a risk assessment. We can apply some of our technology to the network to try and figure out, where you are from a security perspective. So we can give them kind of a risk score and tell them, hey, look, you're doing really well, or you're not doing, great. And here are the reasons why. And then based on that analysis, you can make good, educated decisions, because the reality is you can throw a lot of money at this problem, and it may or may not solve the solution. And no one wants to throw good money after bad, right? And I see that happening sometimes as people just start throwing all this technology at a problem, and guess what? They don't know what the real problem is. So we typically say for these types of organizations, DSOs, it's good to do this initial assessment and then sit down with, the decision makers and say, hey, here are our findings, here are our recommendations, right? This is what you need to do if you really want to implement a security solution versus, throwing some off-the-shelf software on your computers and pretending it's going to work. So that's what we recommend. And it's highly effective. And that's, if you go into the business world and you deal with corporations, that's kind of exactly what they do, right? That's where they start.
That's great. Well, this has been an eye-opening conversation for sure, Gary.
Sure.
We really appreciate it. And we have Gary's contact information at the end of this podcast if you want to reach out to him and his team and find out where you all stand from a cybersecurity perspective. But Gary Salman, really appreciate it. He's CEO and the founder of Black Talon Security. Thanks for joining us today, and
Got it.
Really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great talking to you.
Yep. Good talking to you as well. Thanks everybody for listening and watching the Group Dentistry Now Show. Until next time, I'm Bill Neumann.
The Group Dentistry Now Show has listeners across North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. If you like our show, subscribe today and please tell your colleagues about us.